Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if your study groups are actually fair, or are you just tricking yourself with math that does not mean what you think it means? Today we are looking at a really cool paper about how researchers check if they have done a good job matching up their groups of people. See, in science, we often compare two groups, like people who learn a language from birth versus people who learned it later in life. To be fair, we want those groups to be similar in other ways, like age or education. So the only real difference is the language thing we are studying. We call these extra factors confounders because if you are not careful, they can mess up your results. Imagine testing if coffee makes you smarter, but your coffee drinkers group is entirely made up of university professors, while the non-coffee group is a bunch of toddlers. You are not measuring the beans, you are measuring the age gap. To avoid this, researchers try to match the groups. But here is the big question. When is a match actually a good match? Usually scientists jump to statistics to answer this. They use something called a p-value to see if the groups are significantly different. Think of a p-value like a luck meter. If it is low, it tells you that a difference is probably not just a random fluke. The problem is that researchers often use this luck meter to prove their groups are matched. They think that if the p-value is high, it means their groups are perfectly similar, so they can ignore those extra variables. But this paper argues that this is fundamentally flawed. See, inferential stats are built to tell us about a whole population, not just the small group of people sitting in your lab room. It does not matter if your specific group of 50 people matches the entire human race. It only matters that your specific group matches the other group you are looking at. Here is why this is a practical disaster. Imagine you have two groups and they only differ by 2 years in age. If you have a huge number of people in your study, that tiny 2-year gap might show up as significant. The math will yell at you and say your groups are mismatched. But if you have a tiny group of 10 people, that same 2-year gap might look perfectly fine to the math. The groups are the exact same. But the math is acting totally different based on how many people you have. It is like using a scale that lies to you based on how many apples you put on it. That is no way to do science. So if the math is wrong, what should we do? The author suggests we stop using magic numbers and start using our eyes. Just looking at the data is actually a lost art. By looking at histograms or pictures of how the ages are spread out, you can see if the groups really overlap enough. If one group is all 30-year-olds and the other is all retirees, you have a problem. But if the groups mix together on a chart, you are likely in the clear. It is about using common sense and expertise about the topic to decide if the difference matters for your specific study. Think of it like choosing a team for a pickup basketball game. You do not ask a calculator to run a p-value to see if the teams are equal. You look at the players, check their heights, look at their skills, and decide if the teams are balanced enough to have a fair game. Science needs that same human touch. It is okay to be subjective if you are being smart about it. This really changes how we should read papers. We should stop trusting the p-values at the start of a study and instead demand to see the actual data graphs. If the graphs show that the participants are properly mixed, that tells you more than any statistical test ever could. The author even points out that when we rely on complex math to fix these problems later, like using regression models, we often just make our science more complicated and less reliable than it needs to be. Sometimes the simplest way to fix a problem is to just make sure your research design is solid from the start. I think this study is a great wake-up call. It reminds us that statistics are a tool, not a replacement for thinking. We should not be afraid to look at the raw data and let our scientific intuition lead the way. Future research could definitely look into better ways to provide these visual summaries for readers. For now, just remember that if someone claims their groups are perfectly matched because of a p-value, you might want to ask to see the charts. Thanks for joining me in the Mind Lab today. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts on whether you think math or common sense should rule the lab, and make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the science of how we think. See you next time.